July 15, 1943, Hearne, Texas, 11:47 hours. The train slowed as it approached the small town northeast of Austin, its wheels screeching against sun-heated rails. Inside the converted passenger cars, 300 German prisoners of war sat in silence, staring through barred windows at a landscape that seemed designed to punish. The temperature had already climbed past 100 degrees. The Texas prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, flat, brown, hostile. No trees offered shade, no breeze offered relief. Just crushing heat that turned the rail cars into ovens, that made woolen Wehrmacht uniforms stick to skin, that confirmed every terrible expectation these men had carried across the Atlantic. Obergefreiter Klaus Hübner, captured 3 months earlier in Tunisia, when Rommel's Afrika Korps finally collapsed, pressed his face against the window's metal grating. He was 24 years old, from a village near Bremen, where summer meant 70 degrees and gentle rain. This Texas heat was something else entirely. Biblical, apocalyptic, the kind of temperature that made breathing feel like drowning in hot sand. Around him, his fellow prisoners sweated in silence, conserving energy, preparing mentally for whatever fresh hell awaited them. They had been warned about America. Not by their captors, the American guards had been professional, even courteous, but by their own expectations, by propaganda they half believed and rumors they fully credited. America was barbaric, they had been told. America was lawless. America would treat German prisoners the way the Reich treated captured Soviets, brutally, with contempt for the Geneva Conventions, with the casual cruelty of a nation too young and too uncivilized to understand the rules of war. The train stopped. Guards shouted orders in English. The prisoners gathered their meager belongings, spare shirts, letters from home, photographs of families they might never see again. They filed out onto a wooden platform that radiated heat like a skillet. The sun hammered down. The air shimmered. In the distance, beyond a fence topped with barbed wire, they could see their new home, Camp Hearne, a collection of tar paper barracks arranged in military rows. Guard towers at the corners, the whole compound surrounded by wire and open ground that would make escape suicidal. This was it. This was where they would sit out the war, however long that took. Months, certainly. Years, probably. Perhaps forever. If the rumors about Germany's deteriorating military situation were true, Hübner shouldered his pack and joined the line of prisoners shuffling toward the camp entrance, toward the gates that would close behind them, toward whatever waited in the American hell of Texas summer heat. What waited was something none of them expected, to understand. The profound dissonance between expectation and reality that German POWs experienced in Texas, to grasp. Why men who anticipated brutality instead encountered hospitality. We must first examine the vast machinery of American prisoner of war administration that had been constructed with remarkable speed after Pearl Harbor. By the summer of 1943, the United States faced a logistical problem of extraordinary scale. The war in North Africa had concluded with the surrender of over 275,000 Axis troops, German and Italian soldiers who could not be efficiently housed in Britain, could not be left in Africa where they would strain Allied logistics, and could not be repatriated while the war continued. The solution was to ship them across the Atlantic to the continental United States, where space was abundant, where they could be housed far from any combat zone, and where, critically, they could be put to work addressing America's acute labor shortage. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, which established detailed rules governing POW housing, feeding, employment, and treatment. Unlike Nazi Germany, which observed the Geneva Convention selectively, treating Western Allied prisoners reasonably while systematically murdering Soviet POWs, the United States took its treaty obligations seriously. This was partly moral principle, partly pragmatic reciprocity. American prisoners in German hands would be better treated if Germans in American hands were treated well. The War Department established over 500 POW camps across the United States, ranging from large base camps holding thousands of prisoners to small branch camps attached to farms or lumber operations. The camps were concentrated in the South and Southwest, regions with mild winters where prisoners could be housed in simple structures, where labor-intensive agriculture desperately needed workers, and where the local population was sufficiently distant from combat zones to minimize security concerns. Texas, with its vast agricultural operations, its cotton fields requiring intensive hand labor, and its sprawling emptiness that made escape futile, became a major center of POW housing. By 1945, Texas would host more than 50,000 German prisoners in dozens of camps scattered across the state. Camp Hearn, established in early 1943, was among the first, designed to hold 4,800 prisoners who would be contracted out to local farmers, ranchers, and businesses desperate for labor that domestic workers could no longer provide. The German prisoners arriving at these camps carried with them expectations shaped by Nazi propaganda and by their own military's conduct. They had been told that Americans were mongrels, racially inferior, incapable of the discipline and efficiency that defined German culture. They had been told that American justice was mob justice, that the rule of law was weak, that prisoners would be at the mercy of guards with no accountability. Some had heard whispered rumors, almost certainly, false but widely believed, that America would work prisoners to death in conditions reminiscent of Soviet labor camps. The reality waiting for them in Texas was profoundly different. The first shock came at the camp gates, when German prisoners were processed not by brutal guards but by efficient administrators who checked their names against Red Cross lists, verified their ranks, and explained, through interpreters, the camp rules in careful detail. They were told about their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be housed in clean barracks, would receive adequate food and medical care, would be paid for their labor, would be allowed to send and receive mail, would not be required to perform work directly contributing to the American war effort. The prisoners were issued clean uniforms. Army surplus dyed to remove the original color, with PW stenciled on the back. They were shown to their barracks, simple wooden structures with screen windows, concrete floors, electric lighting, and running water. Each barracks held about 60 men in two-tier bunks. Mattresses were thin but adequate. Blankets were provided. The facilities were Spartan but far superior to what most of these men had experienced during Rommel's final months in Africa, where the Afrika Korps had been starved of supplies, where soldiers slept in foxholes, where food and water were luxuries rationed with desperate care. Klaus Hübner dropped his pack on an assigned bunk and looked around in confusion. The barracks were clean. The windows had screens to keep out insects. The toilet facilities, separate buildings with flush toilets and showers, were basic but functional. There were no obvious signs of deliberate cruelty, no calculated deprivation, no atmosphere of sadistic control. It looked like a military base, not a prison camp. It looked unsettlingly like the German army barracks he had trained in before the war. The second shock came at the first meal. The prisoners were marched to mess halls where they lined up with metal trays. The American cooks, both military personnel and German POWs assigned to kitchen duty, served portions that seemed impossible. White bread, real butter, meat, not the gray mystery protein that had sustained the Afrika Korps during its collapse, but actual beef, recognizable and substantial. Potatoes, vegetables, coffee, milk. Hübner stared at his tray. This was more food than he had seen in a single meal since before the war, more than he had eaten during the entire final month in Tunisia. Around him, other prisoners stood frozen, holding their trays, uncertain whether this was a trick, whether they were being fattened for some purpose they couldn't yet imagine, whether tomorrow would bring the real deprivation they expected. They ate. The food was simple, institutional, prepared in bulk for maximum efficiency rather than flavor. But it was abundant. Seconds were allowed. No one left hungry. After months of privation in Africa, after the hunger that had become constant background noise during the Afrika Korps' final retreat, this abundance was disorienting. The Geneva Convention specified minimum caloric requirements for POWs, 2,500 calories per day for those not working, 3,000 for those performing labor. The American camps exceeded these minimums. The standard POW ration in 1943 provided approximately 3,200 calories daily, with supplements for those doing agricultural work. This was more than many American civilians were consuming under wartime rationing. More than German civilians in the Reich were receiving as Allied bombing disrupted food distribution. And vastly more than Soviet prisoners in German camps were given. if they were given anything at all. The abundance was not accidental. American agricultural output in World War II was staggering, vastly exceeding domestic needs even while feeding Allied armies overseas. The United States produced so much food that feeding POWs well was economically trivial. More importantly, well-fed prisoners worked harder, fell sick less often, caused fewer discipline problems, and created fewer headaches for camp administrators. The calculation was ruthlessly pragmatic. Abundance was cheaper than deprivation. The German prisoners' gradual understanding of their situation unfolded over weeks and months as they adapted to the routine of camp life. Reveille at dawn, breakfast, work assignments. Most prisoners were contracted to local farmers who paid the U.S. government for their labor, while the prisoners themselves received token wages in camp scrip. Return to camp by evening, dinner, free time. Lights out. The rhythm was military, familiar, almost comfortable. The work varied depending on the season and the employer. Cotton cultivation and harvest dominated Texas agriculture, requiring intensive hand labor from planting through picking. German prisoners, most of whom came from rural backgrounds in Germany, adapted quickly to agricultural work. They picked cotton alongside civilian laborers, often Mexican bracheros brought north under wartime labor agreements. They learned to pace themselves in the brutal heat, to protect their hands from the sharp cotton bolls, to meet the quotas that determined their small wages. Some prisoners worked in other capacities, maintaining the camp itself, cooking in the mess halls, working in camp hospitals, staffing small factories that produced goods for POW use. The Geneva Convention prohibited forcing prisoners to engage in war production, so the work was carefully limited to agriculture, forestry, and support activities that could not directly aid the American war effort. Conditions varied by employer and location. Some farmers treated their German laborers well, providing shade breaks, offering cold water, paying bonuses for exceeding quotas. Others were more demanding, less generous, viewing the prisoners as tools rather than humans. But even the worst treatment German POWs encountered in Texas was better than what they had expected. Better than what they knew their own nation was, inflicting on prisoners from the East the symbolic object that came to represent American abundance to these prisoners was neither weapon nor uniform, but something far more mundane: white bread. In Germany, even before the war, white bread had been a luxury, reserved for special occasions or for those who could afford premium prices. The standard German bread was dark, heavy, made from rye or mixed grains, nutritious but coarse. In the final years of the war, as Germany's economy crumbled, even this bread became scarce, mixed with sawdust and potato flour, rationed strictly. In Texas, white bread appeared at every meal. Soft, light, made from refined wheat flour slathered with real butter. It was served without ceremony, without restriction, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. For Klaus Hübner and his fellow prisoners, that white bread became a daily reminder of the impossible abundance they had stumbled into, a symbol of American wealth so vast that luxuries could be distributed to enemy prisoners without a second thought. They began to understand that the propaganda had been inverted. America was not poor and chaotic. Germany was poor and chaotic, its economy shattered by war, its population sustained by plunder from occupied territories. America was rich beyond anything they had imagined, so rich that feeding thousands of enemy prisoners above Geneva Convention minimums was trivial, so rich that the question was not whether prisoners would eat, but whether they would gain weight. Many did gain weight. Camp doctors monitored prisoner health and noted with clinical interest that POWs arrived malnourished from Africa and departed, when repatriation eventually came, heavier, healthier, better fed than they had been as soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Medical records from Camp Hearn document this transformation. Prisoners averaging 140 pounds on arrival, 165 pounds after 6 months, their bodies recovering from the deprivation of Rommel's final campaign. The transformation in prisoner attitudes accelerated when they encountered American civilians outside the camps. Farmers who employed German labor found themselves dealing not with barbaric enemies, but with young men who were professional, hard-working, and remarkably similar to their own sons serving overseas. Some farmers invited German workers into their homes for meals. violating fraternization rules but following older Texas traditions of hospitality. Others allowed prisoners to attend local churches under guard, permitted them to participate in sports matches against civilian teams, treated them with a casual friendliness that bewildered men expecting hatred. The town of Hearne itself, a small agricultural community of about 5,000 people, adapted to its role as host to thousands of enemy prisoners with pragmatic acceptance. Local businesses contracted for prisoner labor. The camp orchestra performed public concerts. German prisoners working in town became familiar faces, nodded to on the street, recognized as individuals rather than anonymous enemies. The relationship was not without tension. Some townspeople resented the prisoners' presence, particularly families who had lost sons in combat. But the dominant tone was accommodation rather than hostility. This accommodation reflected both American abundance and American ideology. The United States had food to spare, space to spare, resources to spare. It could afford to treat prisoners well without material sacrifice. More importantly, American culture carried a deep tradition of viewing rules as binding. The Geneva Convention was law, and law was to be followed even when inconvenient, even when dealing with enemies, even when the enemy might not reciprocate. German prisoners noticed this legalism with fascination. In the Reich, law was subordinate to ideology and power. The Führer's will was supreme. Regulations were bent or ignored when convenient. Might made right. In America, even in a remote Texas POW camp, regulations were followed with bureaucratic precision. Prisoners could file grievances through proper channels. Camp inspectors from the International Red Cross visited regularly, interviewed prisoners privately, documented conditions. When violations of Geneva Convention provisions were found, usually minor issues like inadequate heating or excessive work hours, they were addressed through official channels. This was not softness. Camp discipline was strict. Escape attempts were punished. Prisoners who refused to work faced consequences. Guards carried weapons and did not hesitate to use them when security was threatened. But the discipline operated within a framework of rules that applied to guards as well as prisoners, that created predictability rather than arbitrary cruelty, that suggested the Americans actually believed their own propaganda about law and justice. For men raised in Nazi Germany, where law had become whatever the state said it was, this American insistence on following rules, even rules protecting enemy prisoners, was profoundly disorienting. It suggested that the ideological foundation they had been taught was superior had been inverted. The Americans, supposedly weak and decadent because they were restrained by law, were demonstrating that law could be a form of strength, that predictable justice was more powerful than arbitrary tyranny. The cultural and recreational life that developed within Camp Hearne revealed another dimension of American POW policy. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed recreational activities, and the American interpretation was generous. The camp contained multiple sports fields where prisoners organized soccer leagues, volleyball tournaments, and track competitions. A theater was constructed where prisoners staged elaborate productions of German plays and operas. Art classes were offered. A camp library stocked with German language books grew to contain thousands of volumes. Educational programs proliferated. German prisoners with teaching experience offered classes in languages, mathematics, history, and technical subjects. American authorities permitted this partly because the Geneva Convention required it, partly because educated prisoners caused fewer problems than bored ones, and partly because there was a long-term strategic calculation. These men would eventually return to Germany, and a Germany rebuilt by educated former POWs might be more democratic, more stable, more amenable to American influence than one rebuilt by bitter, brutalized veterans. The camp newspaper, printed in German and subject to American censorship, reported camp news, sports scores, cultural events, and carefully selected international news. Prisoners could subscribe to approved German-language publications from neutral countries. They could write letters home, subject to censorship, and receive mail from families in Germany. They could receive packages containing supplementary food, clothing, and personal items. Klaus Hübner found himself performing in the camp orchestra, playing the accordion he had learned as a child in Bremen. The orchestra gave regular concerts attended by both prisoners and occasionally, American guards and local civilians granted special permission. The prisoners performed Beethoven and Brahms, German folk songs, and popular tunes from before the war. For a few hours each week, they could forget they were prisoners, could imagine they were simply musicians performing for an appreciating audience. This cultural life was not universal across all American POW camps. Some were more austere, some less well-equipped, but it was representative of American policy's broader approach. The United States was not just housing enemy prisoners, it was attempting to demonstrate the superiority of its system through treatment that exceeded minimum requirements, that showed abundance rather than deprivation, that suggested Americans fought not from weakness or necessity, but from a position of such overwhelming strength that they could afford generosity. The calculation was explicitly ideological. American military planners and civilian officials understood that these prisoners would return to Germany after the war, would carry with them impressions of American life and values, would become informal ambassadors for democratic capitalism versus whatever system emerged in post-war Europe. Treating them well was investment in post-war reconstruction, a down payment on the world America hoped to create after victory. Not all prisoners were receptive. Camp Hearn, like most POW camps in the United States, contained a minority of hardcore Nazis who maintained ideological discipline, who organized resistance to American corruption, who punished fellow prisoners suspected of being sympathetic to their captors. Violence within camps occasionally erupted, beatings of suspected informers, murders of prisoners deemed traitors for being too friendly with Americans or too critical of the Nazi regime. American authorities struggled with this internal political conflict. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed to maintain their own internal hierarchy and discipline, but it also required protection of prisoners from violence by other prisoners. Camp officials walked a careful line, allowing German military discipline to function while intervening when violence became serious, segregating hardcore Nazis from the general population when necessary, punishing murderers through American military justice system. Klaus Hübner, who had never been particularly ideological even in the Wehrmacht, found himself navigating between extremes: the hardcore Nazis who viewed cooperation with Americans as betrayal, and the growing number of prisoners who recognized that Nazi Germany had led them into disaster, and that perhaps American democracy offered a better model. He kept his head down, avoided political discussions, focused on surviving his captivity and eventually returning home. The historical evidence documenting German POW experiences in Texas comes from multiple sources, each providing different perspectives on the same phenomenon. American military records detail camp administration, prisoner populations, discipline issues, and economic productivity. International Red Cross inspection reports document conditions and Geneva Convention compliance with bureaucratic thoroughness. German military records, fragmentary after the war but substantial, contain some information about prisoners' experiences gleaned from censored letters and post-war debriefings. Most valuable are the prisoners' own accounts, letters written during captivity, diaries kept secretly despite regulations, and extensive post-war memoirs. Many former POWs wrote about their Texas experiences decades later, their accounts colored by nostalgia, but containing verifiable details that align with documentary evidence. A substantial number of former Camp Hearn prisoners maintained contact with American families they had met during captivity, returning to Texas as tourists in later years, reflecting on the profound contrast between what they expected and what they experienced. Franz von Papen, a German prisoner at Camp Hearn, not the famous diplomat but a young Obergefreiter from Bavaria, wrote in a post-war memoir, "We arrived expecting to be treated as the Russians were treated in our camps. We arrived expecting brutality, hunger, degradation. Instead, we found law, abundance, and a people who seemed genuinely puzzled by our expectation of cruelty." This cognitive dissonance was more effective than any propaganda in destroying our faith in what we had been taught about German superiority and American decadence. American camp officials noted the transformation with clinical interest. A 1944 report from the Camp Hearn commander observed, "Prisoners arriving from North Africa initially display suspicion and hostility. Within 6 to 8 weeks, as they acclimate to camp routine and recognize that their treatment exceeds their expectations, attitudes shift noticeably. Cooperation increases. Discipline problems decrease. Productivity in work assignments improves. The provision of adequate food, clean housing, and recreational opportunities appears to be more effective than coercion in securing prisoner compliance. Economic data reveals the scale of POW labor's contribution to American wartime production. German prisoners in Texas picked millions of pounds of cotton, harvested vegetables and fruit, cut timber, and maintained infrastructure. Farmers paid the U.S. government standard labor rates for prisoner work, typically the same as civilian laborers. The government retained most of this money to offset the cost of housing and feeding prisoners, while paying each prisoner 80 cents per day in camp scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen on supplementary items. This was exploitation. In economic terms, prisoners received far less than the value of their labor, but it was exploitation within the Geneva Convention's framework, which permitted prisoner labor under specific conditions. More importantly, from the prisoner's perspective, the work was preferable to idleness. The wages bought small luxuries, and the interaction with American civilians provided welcome break from camp monotony. The statistical record of Camp Hearn is fragmentary but suggestive. Between 1943 and 1945, the camp held approximately 4,800 German prisoners at peak capacity. Escape attempts were rare. The isolation and heat made successful escape effectively impossible. Serious discipline issues requiring military justice were infrequent. Deaths from disease or accident were minimal, far below the rate for civilians or soldiers. The camp functioned efficiently as a mechanism for housing enemy prisoners and extracting their labor while treating them according to international law. The summer of 1944 brought news of the Normandy invasion and the Soviet offensive in the East, communicated through censored camp newspapers and through the prisoner grapevine that operated. Despite regulations against discussing war news, German prisoners understood that their nation was losing, that the Reich's territorial empire was collapsing, that the war they had expected to win was being lost decisively. This knowledge created complex emotional responses: relief that captivity meant safety from the carnage consuming their comrades, guilt at surviving while others died, anxiety about what defeat would mean for Germany and for their families. American guards noticed the prisoners' morale shift as the war news worsened. Some became more cooperative, openly acknowledging that Germany would lose and that cooperation with American authorities was pragmatic. Others withdrew into sullen silence, processing the collapse of everything they had fought for. The hardcore Nazis became more aggressive, cracking down on defeatism within the prisoner population, maintaining ideological discipline through intimidation. Klaus Hübner followed the war's progress with mixed feelings. He wanted Germany to survive. His family was in Bremen, which was being bombed regularly by Allied aircraft. But he increasingly doubted whether German victory was possible or even desirable. The propaganda he had believed as a young soldier seemed obviously false now that he had experienced American abundance firsthand. Now that he understood the vast industrial and agricultural might arrayed against the Reich, Germany had picked a fight with an opponent so wealthy that it could feed enemy prisoners better than German civilians were eating. The outcome seemed inevitable. The symbolic white bread that appeared at every meal took on new meaning as the war news deteriorated. Each slice represented the material gap between the combatants: America's effortless abundance versus Germany's desperate scarcity. Hübner began to see the bread not just as food but as a message. You cannot win. You never could win. We are so wealthy that feeding you is trivial, while your nation starves. Surrender is not defeat. It is recognition of reality. This was psychological warfare through hospitality, though it operated subtly rather than through explicit propaganda. The American authorities did not lecture German prisoners about democracy or capitalism. They simply demonstrated its results: full shelves at the camp canteen, abundant meals, recreational facilities, legal protections, predictable justice. The system sold itself through its outcomes rather than through rhetoric. Not all prisoners were converted. Many maintained loyalty to Germany even while acknowledging the war was lost. Viewing their captivity as honorable service, they had fought until capture, and now they would wait out the war's conclusion with discipline intact. Others, particularly older prisoners and those who had never been enthusiastic Nazis, began to imagine a post-war life very different from the Reich's promises. Perhaps Germany could become more like America, prosperous, peaceful, governed by law rather than ideology. These conversations happened in whispers, in small groups of trusted friends, away from the hardcore Nazis who viewed such talk as treason. But they happened increasingly as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, as the gap between Nazi promises and visible reality became too wide to ignore. May 8, 1945, brought news of Germany's unconditional surrender. The prisoners at Camp Herne received the information through official channels and through rumors that spread within hours. The war in Europe was over. Germany had been utterly defeated, occupied by Allied armies, its government dissolved, its future uncertain. For the prisoners, the news brought profound relief mixed with profound anxiety. They would survive. They would eventually go home. But what home would they return to? The immediate expectation was that repatriation would happen quickly, within months, perhaps weeks. The reality was far slower. American and British authorities faced enormous logistical challenges, feeding millions of displaced persons in Europe, re-establishing civilian governments, processing millions of surrendered German soldiers, and deciding what to do with prisoners held overseas. The POWs in America found themselves in a peculiar limbo, no longer fighting a war, but not yet free to leave, waiting in camps that had become familiar, almost comfortable. Repatriation from Camp Herne began in 1946 and continued into 1947. Prisoners departed in groups, shipped back across the Atlantic to a Germany they barely recognized. The cities they had left intact were now rubble. The families they had known were scattered or dead. The nation they had fought for no longer existed, replaced by occupation zones administered by former enemies. The prosperity they had experienced in Texas, the abundant food, the clean facilities, the recreational opportunities, stood in stark contrast to the devastation awaiting them at home. Klaus Hübner returned to Bremen in early 1946 and found his family's house damaged but standing, his mother alive but aged beyond her years, his father dead in the war's final months. The city was rubble, its port facilities destroyed, its economy non-existent. Food was scarce, rationed, at levels below what Hübner had eaten as a prisoner in Texas. The white bread that had been daily routine in Camp Herne was now unavailable at any price. He found work in the reconstruction effort, helping to clear rubble and rebuild infrastructure. The physical labor was familiar from his agricultural work in Texas, but the context was different. He was working not for wages but for survival, not in abundance, but in scarcity. The experience of captivity had given him standards of comparison that made Germany's post-war deprivation even more striking. He had seen how wealthy a nation could be. He had experienced what prosperity looked like. And he understood that Germany's path back to anything resembling normal life would be long and difficult. In the decades after the war, many former Camp Herne prisoners maintained contact with Americans they had met during captivity. Some corresponded with farmers who had employed them, with guards who had treated them fairly, with townspeople who had shown kindness. These relationships, fostered through letters and occasional visits, became informal bridges between former enemies, personal connections that transcended national conflict. A small number of former prisoners eventually immigrated to the United States, settling in Texas or other states, building American lives. Others visited as tourists, bringing their families to show them where they had spent the war years, reminiscing about experiences that seemed increasingly distant as decades passed. These return visits often surprised the former prisoners. The camps themselves had mostly been dismantled, the barracks torn down, the land returned to agriculture or left empty. Camp Herne's physical structures were gone by the 1950s, leaving only foundations and memories. The epilogue of the German POW experience in Texas extends beyond individual stories to larger historical questions about ideology, material prosperity, and the nature of democratic capitalism's appeal. The prisoners who passed through American camps carried with them not propaganda, but lived experience. They had seen American abundance firsthand, had been beneficiaries of a legal system that protected even enemy prisoners, had encountered a society wealthy enough to treat generosity as routine rather than exceptional. This experience shaped post-war Germany in ways difficult to quantify but nonetheless significant. Former POWs returned with knowledge that America was neither barbaric nor weak, that democratic capitalism produced remarkable prosperity, that law-governed societies could function efficiently without totalitarian control. In the decades of reconstruction that followed, as West Germany rebuilt itself along democratic capitalist lines and eventually became one of Europe's most prosperous nations, the influence of former POWs who had seen the American model firsthand cannot be entirely discounted. The symbolic white bread that had represented American abundance during the war years became, in a sense, Germany's post-war goal, not the bread itself, but what it represented: prosperity, stability, law, the ability to treat luxuries as ordinary. The Federal Republic of Germany that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s achieved this goal, becoming wealthy enough that white bread was unremarkable, that food scarcity was historical memory, that the legal protections and democratic norms modeled by America became German practice. This was not inevitable. East Germany, under Soviet occupation and communist governance, took a different path, one characterized by scarcity, ideological control, and the subordination of individual rights to state power. The contrast between the two Germanys after 1949 paralleled the contrast German POWs had experienced between their expectations and the reality of American captivity. One system that treated abundance and legal protection as achievable norms, another that treated scarcity and control as necessary conditions. The deeper truth illuminated by the Texas POW camps is about the relationship between material prosperity and ideological appeal. Totalitarian systems can inspire through ideology, through promises of glory or racial destiny or historical inevitability. But democratic capitalism's appeal operates differently, not through promises but through visible results, not through rhetoric but through lived experience of abundance and justice. The German prisoners who arrived at Camp Herne, expecting hell and experienced hospitality, instead were confronting this difference directly. They had been taught that their system was superior, more disciplined, more efficient, more aligned with history's inevitable direction. Instead, they found themselves in a system that was manifestly wealthier, demonstrably more just, and clearly more powerful. The cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality could not be easily resolved through ideology. It demanded acknowledgement that perhaps the propaganda had been wrong, perhaps the war had been not just militarily unwinnable, but ideologically misguided. Not every prisoner reached this conclusion. Some maintained Nazi beliefs despite evidence. Some simply wanted to survive and go home. Some drew no larger lessons from their captivity, but enough prisoners were affected that the aggregate impact mattered. Enough to shape post-war German society's receptiveness to American influence. Enough to facilitate the surprisingly rapid transformation of West Germany from defeated enemy to democratic ally. On quiet Texas evenings in the years after the war, farmers who had employed German prisoners sometimes reflected on the strange circumstances that had brought enemy soldiers to pick cotton in their fields. The war seemed distant now, almost unreal, hard to reconcile with memories of young German men working alongside Mexican bracheros, eating lunch in the shade, speaking broken English, being fundamentally human despite their uniforms and their nationality. The land where Camp Herne stood returned to agriculture. The barracks were dismantled. The guard towers came down. The barbed wire was rolled up and recycled. By the 1950s, almost no physical trace remained of the thousands of German prisoners who had spent years there, who had experienced the peculiar combination of captivity and hospitality that characterized American POW policy. But the intangible traces persisted, in letters exchanged across the Atlantic, in memories carried by former prisoners who never forgot their time in Texas, in the small ways that personal contact across national boundaries worked against future enmity. The German soldiers who had expected hell and found abundance instead became, in aggregate, informal ambassadors for the proposition that America's wealth and justice were real rather than propagandistic, that the democratic capitalist model produced results that totalitarian alternatives could not match. The white bread that appeared at every meal in Camp Herne's mess halls, soft, light, abundant, unremarkable to Americans but revolutionary to Germans, symbolized this larger truth. It was not just bread. It was evidence that American prosperity was real, that the system that produced such abundance was functional, that the Reich's promises of superiority had been hollow. Every slice consumed by a prisoner was a small admission that the war had been fought on false premises, that Germany had challenged an opponent whose strength was rooted not in ideology, but in material reality. This is what German POWs discovered in Texas, that hell can be inverted by abundance, that hospitality can be more powerful than hatred, that the most effective propaganda is not rhetoric, but lived experience of prosperity and justice. They arrived expecting cruelty because cruelty was what they had been taught to expect, what their own nation inflicted on captured enemies, what seemed natural in total war. Instead, they encountered a system that followed its own rules even when dealing with enemies, that treated law as binding even when inconvenient, that demonstrated through daily practice the principles it claimed to uphold. The legacy of Camp Hearn and camps like it across America is not captured in statistics of prisoners housed or cotton bales picked or Geneva Convention provisions fulfilled. It is captured instead in the transformation of expectations, in the slow recognition by thousands of individual prisoners that the world was different than they had been taught, that prosperity and justice were possible, that the side they had fought for had been not just militarily defeated, but ideologically mistaken. When Klaus Hübner died in Bremen in 1993, his grandchildren found among his possessions a small cache of letters from Texas, correspondence with the farmer who had employed him, notes from American guards, photographs of Camp Hearn's orchestra. They found a worn notebook containing his prison diary, entries recording his gradual understanding that American captivity was preferable to German freedom, that the enemy's abundance exceeded the homeland's scarcity, that the white bread was real and its implications profound. This is what remains. Individual memories of abundance where brutality was expected, of law where chaos was anticipated, of hospitality where hell was promised. The Texas heat was real. The work was real. The captivity was real. But so was the generosity, the legal protection, the demonstration through daily experience that democratic capitalism's promises were not merely propaganda but achievable reality. The German prisoners who passed through Texas carried this knowledge back to a defeated nation, where it joined with millions of other experiences and observations to shape post-war reconstruction. They had seen America not through propaganda but through direct experience. They had lived in the system, eaten its food, worked its fields, encountered its justice. And they understood with varying degrees of consciousness and articulation that they had witnessed something their own ideology insisted was impossible, a prosperity so vast that feeding enemies was trivial, a legal system so robust that even enemies had rights, a confidence so complete that demonstrations of abundance were more persuasive than assertions of superiority. That was the lesson of Camp Hearn, that abundance defeats ideology, that hospitality transforms enemies, that the white bread on the mess hall table every morning was more powerful than any weapon, any speech, any propaganda campaign. It was just bread, but it was also evidence of everything the prisoners had been told was false about America, and everything they were learning was true, and in that recognition lay the seeds of post-war transformation, personal, national, ideological, that helped shape the world that emerged from war's devastation.